Principles as a bridge between theory and practice. A paper by John Skaar, Bølviken, Koskela and Kalsaas. Hello, my name is John Skaar. I'm very sorry that we couldn't meet up in Peru. That would be great. Zoom is the best alternative we can have these days, but hopefully we'll meet next year. So, principles as a bridge between theory and practice. Why this topic? Do we feel it is of importance? Yes, we do. We believe it's very important to let practice be reflected in theory and vice versa. When presenting this paper, I will go through the following agenda. Firstly, give an introduction related to my own experience on the topic. In the second point, go through the methods and approach we have used in this paper. Thirdly, talk about what are principles and explain our point of departure. In the fourth point, have a brief walkthrough of principles history and their way towards lean. Then we want to pinpoint what we believe is not a principle. And in point 6, we will go over to the discussion around principles' position as a bridge between theory and practice. And we will end by making a short summary and presenting the conclusion. I want to start with when I was first introduced to lean construction. My introduction came through the last planner system, and with the support of the academia we went along introducing it to a project. We met our ups and downs, and thankfully the academia learned us that this was not only a system, but this was a way of thinking. It was a part of a way of thinking. So even if we had some struggles, we managed to see an effect with the system. And I've been a lean believer ever since. But if I was introduced to some tools, some methods or systems that I felt didn't fit the environment, or didn't fit the context I was working in, would I then have left lean construction as a whole? I believe the possibility is there, and I believe a lot of people meets lean construction, misunderstands it, gets a bad experience with it, and then leaves back to the traditional way of doing it. I believe they lose something if they do. So, what should we do? I believe we should focus more on the principles. When introducing lean, we should focus on the principles and the tools and the methods and the system, but do not forget the principles. Because the principles, they are more durable. The systems and tools are just there. And if the systems and tools does not fit the context they're trying to work in, you change the system, you change the tools, you change the methods, but you rarely change the principles. The principle, a leader leads by example, not by force, is an example of a principle both guiding on what to do and what not to do. It's often presented as Sun Tzu quote. This is not documented, but the point is that it might show that the principle has the ability to survive and have lasting capabilities for a long time. These principles are still applicable today and relevant to challenge many of the current leaders. When it comes to method and approach, we have chosen to make philosophical conceptualization in this paper. Some of the conceptualization are supported by a literature review, but it's also anchored in theoretical reasoning and discussion on principles' characteristics and which effect they have both in practice and theory. Our point of departure are anchored in this pyramid. Our focus are on the position the principles has laying between theory and methods, tools and practices. We focus on about this important role they have in between these two worlds. So it's important to understand that principles can both be theory and practice based. Very often a combination of this. They are both deduced from logical thinking and induced from practical learning.
This is a key element and a key attribute for a principle. Another key attribute for a principle is that it can challenge the receiver of the principle. A principle can spur the receiver to use hers or his knowledge and take action relevant to the situation or the context the receiver is in. Principles have a long history in different areas. They have been used in religion and have a rather strong position in warfare. In warfare, their use can be traced back to the Chinese warlords. And the principles of war are often connected as a representation of the art of war. Principles still have an eminent role in modern warfare, with many nations using them actively both in theory and in practice. In military academy, Antoine Henri Jomini and Carl von Clausewitz and their different approach and use of principle are still under debate. Jomini being static and using the principle as absolute rules, where Carl von Clausewitz being more dynamic, urging the user of the principle to evaluate the context and applicability of the principles. Von Clausewitz even creates different principles for operational, tactical and strategic level. Their different interpretation is also interesting to evaluate up against the substance view and the process view mentioned in Koskela and Caggiolo's article that we use as a starting point for this paper. Business have inherited the word strategy from warfare. Henrik Fayol being one of the pioneers taking the same way of thinking into business. In 1916, Fayol introduced his principle for management inspired by the military principles of war. When it comes to principles history towards lean, we have made a literature review on this in the paper. We start with Frederick Taylor, Principles for Scientific Management, where we can find early principles within, for example, standardization and continuous improvement. Deming later introduced his 14 points for the new philosophy. We interpret these points for being defined as principles. It's important to note that we, in the paper, do not claim to have made a comprehensive list of all contributions to lean principles, but it's natural to take in Womack and Jones's 5 principles for lean because of their popularity, especially outside of academia. Leiker also introduces 14 principles for lean management inspired by the Toyota way of working. In 2009, Ballard also defines 5 principles, claiming them to be the inspiration of the last planner system. None of these contributions claim to a comprehensive list of lean construction, with the exception of Womack and Jones, who is very often presented as a substitute for lean thinking. We disagree with this being a comprehensive list. There are many definitions of principles out there, and it's important for us to state what we say is not a principle. Scientific laws or absolute rules are not defined as principles in our view, and not methods or tools. We also believe that the principles should be action-oriented and not conclusive. In the discussion of the principles, we find it interesting to discuss the delicate fit between the principles, how this creates dynamic between them. You can emphasize on one principle and challenging it by another. They can function in combination, or they can function as individual principles. In the paper, we also discuss if principles can represent lean theory. We find it interesting that principles often can show something more or something less of the theory they want to represent. This creates a dynamic, and it also is an interesting topic to discuss further. We also see that principles can be customized to the context they're in. That can be both in combination, how you combine them, but it can also be that you rephrase them to your context. Some principles can also be quoted as metaphors, which means that they can be used in a more general way, because they open the room for interpretation. It's also interesting to see the principles in the light of process view versus substance view. We believe that principles representing lean should show process view and be actively and process-based in their viewpoint. As a conclusion of this discussion, we feel that principles are yet to be phrased as a comprehensive list representing lean theory. As for the conclusion, we find principles to be guiding, dynamic, adjustable, durable. We feel they should be action-oriented. They have both prescriptive and descriptive capabilities, and last but not least, they have the capacity to facilitate both inductive and deductive reasoning, meaning also abductive reasoning. Principles are guiding in the sense that they are loosely prescriptive and give a direction in how to act. They are not conclusive, but still give an understanding on what direction is wanted. Consider the principle start with the end in mind. It does not tell exactly what to do, but still challenges where to start, or at least where to start reasoning. The principle might have a logic and even almost a self-evident rationale, but since we have a tendency not to follow them in our daily work or drift away from this way of acting, they demand frequent reaction and maintenance. Principles are dynamic in the sense that they challenge the status quo. The dynamic capability they have on their own, but there are often synergies when different principles are put up against each other. Consider here the principle create flow up against the principle make it visual. They can both challenge their own turf and create endless improvements just by putting them up against each other. Sometimes principles can even be contradictory to each other. Here we can use the example with the principle reduce waste and one-piece flow. There are many situations where creating one-piece flow might create more waste, at least in a short-term perspective. What you should do in any given context and situation are up for reasoning. And by adding another principle, like fail fast and small to learn, can even give more depth and reasoning into the situation. When we say a principle can have the capability to be adjustable, this is in a way a countermeasure for not making the principle generic. But even though principles can strive for general capabilities close to theory, they might need to be rephrased or adjusted to have a wanted outcome in practice. If you use metaphors, people understand straight away that this reasoning has to happen. So that's also another way of making principle adjustable. Principles representing a theory ought to be durable and strive for generic capabilities. But principles' durability also lengthens because of the way they are formed. Because they must be interpreted on their way down towards practice. Hence, the user must add knowledge and understanding to the principle in order to make it operational. This add-on can change over time, but still be so reluctant for change that a culture can be built around their use. In our definition, principle should be phrased action-oriented. This is as a response to the process view and always being in the search for something better. Principles can be somewhat prescriptive and closely linked to the guiding capabilities, but also descriptive in the way that the user defines the actual response. This duality leads to their not only capability to facilitate adaptive reasoning, but also that the principles are often and should be built with this reasoning in mind. Principles having this capability function as a two-way bridge between theory and practice.
This finalized the presentation. Hope you liked it. Hope you liked the paper. But most of all, we hope that principles can have the position they deserve, and that we can discuss principles more within lean construction, and by that building better theory and better practices. Hope to discuss this further with you on IGLC. Thank you for listening.